Hi, folks. In this story set, we are still thinking about the period of the 1800s and social change, but we are looking at those issues as they affected women during this period. Now, as we leave, your story set on slave narratives, I think it's interesting to point out that the abolition movement, or the movement to end slavery, and the women's rights movement had a very close alliance for much of history up until the Civil War. The suffrage movement, or the movement for the women's right to vote, was actually founded because two women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, wanted to attend an anti-slavery convention and were refused entry because they were women. So Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs advocated for women. Many of the most vocal people in the suffrage movement advocated to end slavery. So these two movements have a lot of sort of commonality in terms of their relationship with each other, but we're focusing on the women's side of this today. Now, I do think it's important to preface any conversation about literature dealing with issues of gender, that oftentimes people see these sorts of issues, often in the discussion of the historical oppression of women, we see these things and people perceive it as an issue of men oppressing women, or men versus women. And that comes from our modern perspective, right? How, especially, women, you might think, how could any woman be against the right to vote? How could any woman be happy in this sort of oppressive situation? And the answer is many of them were. As a matter of fact, one of the most vocal groups in opposition to the right to vote was women, because it was threatening to their identity and what society had established as their identity. So I think it's important to mention this is not about men versus women. Men are not the villains in a conversation about issues of gender. The problem is social belief versus everybody, because social beliefs about gender affected everyone. We're just focusing specifically on how they affected women. I think that's important to establish. Now, in context for this, I want to talk a little bit about what was going on, or what people believed during the 19th century, or the 1800s. So you're probably familiar with the historic idea that men are to be the providers for the family, whereas women would stay at home and take care of children, and those are sort of the traditional roles for men and women. And that was absolutely in place here, but it sort of reaches a new height in the 19th century because we have the birth of something called the cult of domesticity. Now, the cult of domesticity was a social belief about how women should behave, and there were, similar ideas related to men, but specifically for women, the cult of domesticity, or also called the cult of true womanhood, established basically 4 things that a woman should be. She should be pure, spiritually and sexually speaking. She should be pious, meaning religious and demure. She should be submissive to her husband and men around her. She should be domestic, meaning she should care for the home. Now, of course, there is nothing inherently wrong with these qualities, but the social belief at the time was that if you weren't these qualities, or you were anything other than these qualities, that you weren't a true woman, right? So this becomes, very restrictive for a lot of women. Also, during this period of time, you have a lot of industrialization, a lot of inventions, indoor plumbing, washing machines, things like that. So being a domestic caretaker, which used to take a lot of time, is becoming a smaller and smaller and smaller role, relatively speaking. So a lot of women are starting to feel unfulfilled and think, well, is this really all that I'm, meant to do? In addition to this, I think that it's important to understand the way that people perceived men and women at the time. Now, again, this is not an issue of men oppressing women. This is an issue of social belief. And the social belief at the time was that men and women had different brains and different intellectual capabilities. They were starting to, medical science was advancing during this time, although it's still very, very far from what we would consider sound medical practice. And the idea of psychology is starting to develop at this time. However, they still don't understand much about it. And essentially, when they're able to start sort of doing autopsies and looking at the inside of the human body, what they notice is that women's brain tend to be smaller than men's. Now, we know this is because women on average tend to be smaller in frame than men, particularly during this period. But they take this to believe, this means that women are less intelligent than men. They also believed that like the shape of your head determined your personality, or all sorts of wild things about psychology at the time. So, socially speaking, it was a sincerely held belief that women were mentally equivalent to children, meaning the reason that they stayed at home and didn't have jobs or work in politics or anything like that was because their brains weren't capable of it. And during this period of time where you have a lot of women who are starting to get a little bored and wanting to get an education and read and write and participate in social life, the social ideas at that time found that very concerning. And many people believe that women who were overtaxing their brains would either go insane, or that women, stepping out of this cult of domesticity would literally destroy the family structure and society. So this affected Charlotte Perkins Gilman very personally. In her first marriage, she had her only daughter, Catherine, and after the birth of her daughter, she suffered from a severe case of what we would call today postpartum depression. As she was suffering from this, she underwent a very controversial treatment known as the rest cure. The rest cure was essentially solitary confinement for wealthy white women. She was had to be confined to a room. She wasn't allowed to read or write or talk to people. And this was because the reason people thought that she was experiencing these depressive symptoms was because she was overtaxing her brain. So she needed to rest and let her brain sort of, regulate itself. She famously wrote about this in the Yellow Wallpaper because as she underwent the rest cure, it made it much, much worse. As you can expect, a person suffering from actual mental illness is not going to be made better by solitary confinement. They're going to be made worse. And so she, realizing that she's on the brink of a total mental collapse, ends up leaving treatment, leaving her husband and getting a divorce in order to, sort of save her own mental well-being. And then she becomes a fierce advocate for how these social boundaries are harming women and holding society back. And so you are reading an excerpt from our Androcentric Culture, which is a nonfiction text where she talks about these cultural issues and how they're affecting, everyone. And you're also reading from her excerpts from her fictional novel, Herland. What you want to be thinking about is how these social ideas about men and women show up and how she is advocating for different things in regards to them. You also remember literature as a cultural marker. So you want to think about what this tells us about how society was seeing these issues at the time. Remember, a lot of people read Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs and thought there was no way that a black person could be this articulate and well-spoken. And much as there was an alliance between abolition and suffrage, many people also saw these writings of women and thought that any sort of articulate eloquence from women was indication of mental illness. So this is a period of great sort of conflict in terms of equal rights, and you see that in the literature, and we're continuing that as it applies to women. Now, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, rejected the label feminist, although she was a political advocate for her whole life, and she was, by all accounts, a radical. She advocated for a number of things, but essentially what is at the root of her writing is the belief that women are more than wives and mothers, and that was a hot controversy at the time. I look forward to seeing what you think about these and how those sort of ideas that exist in these, how you react to these sort of ideas as they show up in the 19th century.